Super Metroid. The magnum opus of the Super Nintendo. Even 30 years later, holy crap, the 90s were a long time ago, it's still regarded as an absolute masterwork by the Metroid community. Okay, well, actually, a lot of people have raised complaints about the game's controls and physics, considering how buttery smooth the controls are in the games that came after it. But other than that, it still holds up great to this day. Because of this, it's common for younger Nintendo fans who weren't around in the 90s to pick this game up so they can see what all the fuss is about. Especially in recent years, since Metroid's grown quite a lot this decade thanks to Dread and Prime Remastered and Prime 4 upcoming. However, many people who are trying out Super Metroid for the first time end up getting stuck in one particular section of the game, and thus thousands of players uploaded images of this one room onto forums, asking if they had been soft-locked. This section of the game became known as the infamous Noob Bridge, and it would end up becoming a big inside joke among the Metroid community. A player would go online and ask about how to get past this, and we'd all laugh that the Noob Bridge claimed yet another victim before telling them about the run button. It's one of the most popular Metroid memes, alongside Adam simping over Ravenbeak and Why Can't Metroid Crawl? But therein lies the problem. This humorous attitude about Super Metroid's Noob Bridge has caused everyone to overlook something about it that I believe to be pretty important. The Noob Bridge is absolutely terrible game design. Just awful. I mean, seriously. It's a section that's halted so many first-time playthroughs, it's literally become a meme. This isn't like the infamous David Jaffe room in Metroid Dread, where just one guy got stuck there and made a huge stink. No. People turn up on the internet asking how to get past this section all the time. I personally was lucky enough to find out about the Noob Bridge before starting the game, meaning I never fell into this trap. But a lot of players have. Not everybody, of course, but a very large percentile. Now, of course, a lot of you who are familiar with Super Metroid like I am probably don't think this is really that big of a deal, right? Rooms like this in Metroid are common, where you can't leave or progress until you can think your way forward using the tools at your disposal. Fusion is full of roadblocks like this, and it's one of the most beloved games in the series. What's so different about the Noob Bridge in Super Metroid? Is failing to get past this not just a skill issue? Well, no. By the very definition of the word skill, it's not just a skill issue. And there is a huge difference between the Noob Bridge and any of those roadblocks in Fusion you have to think your way past. Because, you see, the Noob Bridge isn't like most Metroid roadblocks. It's not a dead end that you have to leave and revisit later once you get a new upgrade. Heck, the game doesn't even let you leave until you can get past it. The Noob Bridge also isn't a puzzle that you have to get past by bombing your way through a breakable wall, which is how you get past most other rooms like it. No, the way you get past the Noob Bridge is simply by holding down the B button to run so you can get across the collapsing floor. You just use the run button. That doesn't sound so bad, right? But here's the thing. This is the first time the game has required you to use the run button. It hasn't taught you about running or encouraged you to do so at all before this point, after you've already defeated 2 mini-bosses. A little late for a tutorial on such a basic movement feature, don't you think? But of course, do you really need a tutorial to learn something like this? It's a run button in a side-scroller. Surely most players would have figured it out on their own right at the start of the game, just like how they figured out jumping and shooting and even aiming diagonally without any outside help at all. In any other side-scroller, this would be true. However, Super Metroid's run button works less like a normal running mechanic, and more like a diet version of the game's speed booster upgrade. Rather than instantly increasing your base speed, the run button causes Samus to quickly accelerate up to running speed over a brief period. Because of this, when the player is testing out buttons, they're likely not to notice that the B button increases speed at all. All of the other buttons do something immediate and obvious when you press them, while the B button's effect is only noticeable after a second of holding it down while your player is moving. Most likely, the player is going to test out the B button once on Ceres' space colony, assume it does nothing since they were either standing still or didn't hold it down long enough, and move on. Of course, when trying to see if they could run later, the player probably would try out the B button again at some point, but the issue is, Super Metroid's level design really isn't supportive of this kind of running physics. The terrain is very rocky and has a lot of verticality to it, and most of the more flat and open rooms are covered in enemies who you'll have to slow down in order to fight, especially since the positioning of the shoot button and the run button means you can't really do both at the same time. The run button's in a really impractical place to hold down while you're actually running, so players are less likely to try. Now, this does work once you get the speed booster upgrade, since it destroys enemies in your path and its status as an upgrade means the players won't expect to use it as often as they'd use a basic movement mechanic. However, the run button just on its own really isn't very practical, which is why so many players get to this point without knowing it exists. So, just to recap, once the player reaches this point, they'll have no idea the B button does anything since when they tested it out back when they first booted up the game, it didn't do anything noticeable. Maybe they tried checking for a run button later on, but when they tried the B button again, it didn't accelerate the player quickly enough for them to notice anything before releasing B and trying a different button. The game's terrain isn't exactly favorable for running over long distances anyway, especially since you often have to shoot enemies when there are large open areas, so it's unlikely that the player would try again. So now the player is at the Noob bridge, and they've long reached the conclusion that the B button doesn't do anything. The player's first instinct at this point is to backtrack and find another way forward, only to find that their exit has been cut off by this one-way gate. Seeing that they're stuck, the player will come to the conclusion that this room is some kind of puzzle that they'll have to get past. They'll bomb walls and floors to no avail, they'll try jumping across the bridge only to be met with ceiling spikes, and they'll probably try a bunch of other stuff. At no point will it cross the player's mind that this room is meant to be a tutorial and not a puzzle. After all, there's absolutely no indication that this is a tutorial. There's no button prompt like there would be in a modern game. The game doesn't have cute aliens showing you what it needs to do like it does later when it teaches you the wall jump technique, which is actually really well done, and I can't believe that these are in the same game. On top of all that, most first-time players will be at least an hour into the game by the time they get to this point. They've already beaten several mini-bosses and gotten super missiles. The player has every reason to believe that the game has already taught them all the base mechanics back in Ceres Space Colony and Criteria. They've already checked the B button to see if it did anything, and came up empty since Samus speeds up with vehicle physics. They think this room is a puzzle, and they can't seem to solve it. The player is, totally and completely, stuck. Now, of course, this doesn't happen to every player. Of course it doesn't happen to every player. While it is confusing due to the slow acceleration time, plenty of players will figure out that the B button makes Samus run beforehand. For other players, the tutorial will actually work, and they'll figure out about the run button while trying to cross the bridge. Then there's players like me, who learned about the new bridge beforehand. And of course, the game's controls are listed in Super Metroid's home menu. Of course, players who are actively stuck on the new bridge probably won't look at the controls since they think it's a puzzle of some kind and not a tutorial. But if you're the kind of player who likes to go through the control menu before you start playing, then you'll find out about the run button immediately and probably won't get stuck on the new bridge. But for every few players who don't have to worry about the new bridge, there's at least one who gets stuck. And they have no idea how to get past it because it never occurred to them that they have to use a mechanic that the game hasn't taught them yet. After all, it is quite rare for a game as good as this to do such a bad job of telegraphing what a button does, that when the game has a roadblock that simply requires you to use that button to progress, so many players get stuck there that it becomes a meme. For a game that's filled with so much genius design, this is stupid. It's bad enough when you're stuck on a puzzle or can't get past a really tough boss, but this is even worse because it's not about how smart you are or how good you are at the game's combat system. Either you know about the run button or you don't. And if you don't, then, well, you're screwed. You gotta post a picture of the new bridge on the internet, ask how to get past it, and get made fun of. Or just look up a guide. Now, I've brought up my grievances about the new bridge in the Metroid community before, and I got shut down. The people on the Discord I'm in just spat out the oh-so-overused, and in this case, literally misused, buzzword, skill issue. They said it was the player's own fault for not checking the control menu beforehand. And if the player wasn't smart enough to figure out that there's a run button, then they're not smart enough for Metroid anyway. Of course, I've already explained why the run button is very easy to miss, and that goes extra for players who actually are very experienced with Metroid, because this is the only Metroid game that has one. And of course, going through the game's menu before you start playing to look through the long list of controls with descriptions you have no context for really isn't appealing to most players. Especially when controls are usually easy to infer on the Super Nintendo due to the limited number of buttons. You really can't blame a player for wanting to figure out the controls on their own rather than reading this big wall of text. Honestly, I've always found the skill issue argument to be incredibly stupid. Especially in this case since there's no skill in just holding a button down. Just because some of the flaws in a game aren't an issue for players of a higher caliber, doesn't mean they aren't flaws. Sure, maybe you were able to get the hang of Star Fox Zero's perspective switching mechanic, but that doesn't mean that players who found it dizzying and overcomplicated were wrong for preferring the far simpler controls of 64. Just because you enjoy the increased tension of crawling through the phase-on mines in Metroid Prime without save points or proper healing, doesn't mean the other players were pissy crybabies because they hate getting sent back so far every time they die in the game's most challenging sequence. Just because you're always able to complete each of the dungeons in Majora's Mask within the time limit first try, doesn't mean that the people who keep complaining about having to do the dungeons twice because they can't finish them on time don't know what they're talking about. And, more relevant to this, just because you know about an obscure mechanic that's needed to progress forward in an adventure game, that doesn't make anyone who got stuck there stupid just because they never stumbled upon that mechanic. And if the game in question is one that you've done multiple playthroughs of, then this goes for double. Triple if you've been playing and replaying it since you were a young child. If you've gone through this game again and again, then of course you're not going to fall into the same pitfalls as someone who's playing the game for the first time. You already know all the puzzles, you know all the boss patterns, you've mastered the mechanics, or at the very least, you have a vague recollection of most of those things. If you've been playing Super Metroid since you were a kid, then you know you need to hold the B button to run. You won't think twice when passing the Noob Bridge. You've been through phase-on mines a gazillion times, so of course you won't have to worry about dying and getting sent back to the start. The Water Temple in Ocarina of Time may be convoluted and hard to navigate, but at this point, you know it like the back of your hand, so it's not a big deal for you. So, don't disparage the newer players who do struggle with these things. You've been playing this game your whole life. You wouldn't understand, and you have no right to gatekeep. Even if it's your first playthrough too, though, people have different experiences when playing these games. Just because someone had a worse experience than you, doesn't mean they were somehow playing the game wrong. Of course, I'm not saying that games shouldn't be hard. People love a good challenge. I'm just saying that they should be fair. Don't brutally punish the lower level players for their failure to the point where they can't progress and aren't having fun, while letting the skilled players just coast. Unless it's like a Souls-like or something. For Souls-like, being unfair is the entire point. But anyways, the Noob Bridge. It sucks ass. We should stop romanticizing it and finally see it as the utter failure of game design in an otherwise excellent game that it truly is. I can't believe that Super Metroid players have been dealing with this as far back as 1994. Back then you couldn't even look up a guide. How unfortunate. Wait. The original Super Metroid instruction manual had instructions for the dash button this whole time. And unlike the controls menu, people actually used to read the game's manual before popping it in. Wait, so this whole thing could have been avoided if Nintendo just included digital copies of the game's old manuals when they re-released their classic titles? Oh, come on, Nintendo. I mean, not everyone would read them still, but come on!